Hello and welcome to the Mayor's Commission for Citizens with Disabilities. Our mission at the Mayor's Commission is to promote the quality of life, accessibility, and equity in all aspects related to the City of Omaha on behalf of and in cooperation with the citizens of Omaha who experience disabilities. Today we are going to share some information and some ideas on how you can better communicate and better interact and work with persons that may have a disability. Our commission is made up of persons that either have a disability or serve those that have a disability. And we feel it's important to share this information with you today to give you a better idea of how to make you more comfortable and really more aware of better ways to communicate and interact and work with those that have a disability. So our PowerPoint will focus on those points today. We'll go ahead and get started. Our purpose today in the PowerPoint is to preserve and respect the dignity of all citizens, to help able-bodied persons feel more comfortable interacting, working with, and communicating with those that may experience a disability, and to provide practical tips for communication and interacting with citizens who have a disability. People are people first, and this concept is really simple. It's remembering that no matter able-bodied or disabled, people are people first, remembering that the golden rule applies in all situations. Treat people as you'd like to be treated. Be respectful, be patient and listen attentively. Don't rush people to finish their sentences, and never assume that help is needed or wanted. Use careful and thoughtful speech. Enunciate clearly. Ask questions and rephrase if not understood. And always talk to the person, not the person they are with. If someone has a caregiver or an interpreter, remember that you're always speaking to the person. Don't be afraid to ask or talk to someone about their disability. But on the flip side of that, folks may not consider themselves to have a disability, so don't assume that they are necessarily interested or want to talk about their disability. Keep in mind that persons that have a disability are not broken and they do not want pity. And remember that participation and quality of life are rights for all people. Treat adults as adults, regardless of able-body or if a disability is present. Speak to people in the age-appropriate language. Common expressions don't offend folks. If you are speaking to someone who's blind or has a visual impairment, saying things like, "Did you see?" that really doesn't offend people. And just relax and be yourself. I think in all circumstances, that's prudent advice. As we go through the presentation, we have different sections that address different disabilities and the best way to approach people that have that particular disability. And in each section, an expert on that particular disability will address the information.
Hi, my name is Kathy Miklas. I'm a speech-language pathologist, and I will be visiting with you about interacting and communicating with people who may have a speech and or language disability. So the first thing I'd like to share with you is that speech and language is about communication. Communication is giving and receiving messages between people or groups of people. So the speech and language part is about the giving and receiving of those messages. Some people may have speech that is difficult to understand. Some people may have language. They may have difficulty understanding language, or they may have difficulty expressing what they're thinking. People can have speech disorders only. They can have understanding language disorders only. They can have expressing their language, expressing their thoughts, difficulty only, or a combination of those. And some people who have other types of disabilities may have a speech or language difficulty along with that or as part of that other disability. A common thought, or just a kind of general rule, is that the Mayor's Commission recognizes that the city workers, the city employees, may need to get communication finished as quickly as possible, and so these suggestions are meant to expedite that as much as possible. So if someone's speech is hard to understand, if you're trying to talk to someone whose speech is hard to understand, don't assume that just because their speech is difficult to understand, that they also have difficulty thinking or understanding what you are saying. I've experienced many times someone talking to a client of mine, whose speech is hard to understand, and the person who's talking to them talks to them as though this person whose speech is hard to understand can't understand the other person speaking. And that's frequently a faulty assumption. If possible, tell the person whose speech is hard to understand, tell them what words you did understand so that they know what words they can try to fix or say a different way. It's easier sometimes than trying to start the whole message over again. And if you've done a lot of the other strategies we're going to talk about and you're still having trouble, don't be afraid to just say courteously, "I'm sorry, I'm trying really hard, I just don't understand this part of what you're saying." Okay, so if someone's speech is hard to understand, some strategies you can try, and we call them, in my world, we call them repair strategies. That does not mean, we're not saying that the person is broken and that the person needs to be repaired. We're saying that somehow the communication has broken down and we're trying to repair that communication breakdown. So you might want to ask them to use gestures if they can, if there's a gesture they can use that will supplement what they're trying to say. You might ask them if you can give them yes or no questions, or instead of open-ended. So instead of "why are you calling about a city street problem? Are you calling about a transportation problem? Are you calling about poor service?" So sometimes if you can give them more specific topics, it's easier for you then to understand what they are telling you in return. If there are pictures, or for example, in restaurants, picture menus, if you can offer those, that may help you that may help them to explain themselves better. Or if they have, you can ask them if they have a picture board or a communication board, because that may help you to understand them better. You can ask them if they can write out what they're trying to say or draw out what they're trying to say, especially the parts that you're not getting. You can ask them if they can rephrase it or repeat it. Sometimes repeating it once will help the other person, the person who's trying to listen to them. Sometimes putting it in different words will help. Okay. Now, if you have a person who's trying to communicate with you who's having difficulty using or understanding language, their speech is understandable, but they're just not able to get out the words. They can't think of the words that they want to say. So some of the things you can do for that, or you can ask them if they want you to try to fill in the words if they're having trouble. For some people, when other people start interrupting them and filling in words, especially if those words then are the wrong words, that interrupts their thought process, and then they have to kind of start over again. So they don't want people to fill it in for them. It's really helpful, as you're going to hear from other speakers as well, it's really helpful to reduce the background noise and the distractions so that the person who's having difficulty understanding language can focus just on what you're saying to them. It's also helpful if the person who's talking to you if they're hard to understand, if you reduce the background noise or the distractions, it's easier then for you to hear what they're saying. It's helpful for you if they're having trouble understanding to use short, direct statements and questions rather than the long, complicated sentences that I'm using today. And then it's really helpful, and again, you'll hear this from other speakers, when you're trying to emphasize an important point, it's really helpful to pause before and after the important words in your message, as you just heard me do. Did you have a question? Please ask your question.
So when a person is pausing before or after the words,
Go ahead.
When a person is pausing before or after words, does that come off as condescending to the person that has a speech problem?
That's a great
just to repeat the question, if someone would pause before or after important words, is it possible that they may come off condescending to certain people?
I think it really all depends on how you're talking. If you're saying, okay, dearie, let me tell you what I said, that would maybe sound condescending. But if you're doing it in a matter-of-fact voice, like I just did, I'm going to talk to you about the communication strategies that people can use. That doesn't sound as condescending because as I'm saying it matter-of-factly. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then the last part is, again, if the person is having difficulty using or understanding language, sometimes you can ask them, or you can supplement what you're saying to them by using gestures, by using pictures, by writing or drawing. Many times people who are having difficulty understanding language, they can understand the nonverbal things. They can understand writing, they can understand drawing, they can understand gestures. It's just the spoken words that they're having difficulty understanding. So if you can use other strategies when you're talking to them, that helps them understand as well. If you sometimes it helps to start with a warm-up question, and by warm-up I just mean something that they can say to you that will kind of get you used to their pattern of speaking. So you can ask them, how are you? How are you doing today? What's your name? Where do you live? Something that helps you to get an idea of what their speaking pattern is. Then your brain will adjust to their speaking pattern, and then you can understand them better. So that helps sometimes also. And then the last thing, and this is again for somebody who's having trouble understanding language, it's really helpful to give them time to process what you said. So again, you don't want to be talking for as long without pausing as I am. You want to give them short sentences, then pause, give them time to process that before you jump into the next part. Especially if you're giving them a lot of detailed information. It's really helpful to pause and give them time to process before you continue. Thank you.
Blind and visually impaired people, it is really important to make sure to talk directly to the person and not the person they are with. Oftentimes, someone may have a caregiver with them or someone to guide them, and it's important to speak directly to that person. Wait for them to offer their hand in greeting versus reaching out and grabbing their hand. It's just common courtesy. When approaching from behind, make sure you verbalize you're there. Place a hand on their shoulder or tap their shoulder to let them know you're present. Also, if someone looks disoriented or in need of help, approach and ask them if they need assistance. As a point was made earlier, make sure you don't assume that someone is in need of your help. Ask for their arm to guide them versus grabbing or pushing or shoving them. And make sure to do not distract their guide dog. Their guide dog is their eyes, and it has a job to do. When helping a blind or visually impaired person get oriented to a room, it sometimes can be helpful to place their hands on items or objects in the room, such as the backs of chairs. This really helps them to see the room and orient to their surroundings. There's no need to avoid phrases. Again, as mentioned earlier, someone that's blind or visually impaired is not going to take offense if you said, "Did you see?" or "Do you watch?" And also, when entering or exiting a room, make sure to say hello and goodbye. Tell them your name, just to verbally acknowledge and let them know that you're there and when you're leaving.
Can I just clarify that the reason that Mike is doing the presentation for blind and visually impaired is because we are in the process of getting a member on our commission who is blind or visually impaired. Currently, we don't have such a member, so Mike is stepping in for them.
Thank you, Kathy. Absolutely, and it's extremely important. It's important information in helping the folks that work for the City of Omaha how to better serve citizens that may be blind or visually impaired.
Hello, my name is Michaela Williams, and today I'm going to be talking about communicating with seniors. I've personally worked with seniors for over 20 years now, and what I want to first begin talking about are some of the different barriers to communication that can be present when you're talking to some of our older population. One of them is hearing loss. It's very common. As we age, we tend not to hear things like we used to. We also have issues with our vision and our mobility. And all three of those can cause a lot of obstacles when we're trying to discuss things. Memory loss and dementia may also make a conversation very complicated. And seniors can be isolated, and sometimes they engage in lengthy conversations. When we talk about these different barriers to communication, I also want to remind everyone that not all seniors have these issues. And they also can have a combination of one or another. So you just have to really focus on the person that you're communicating with and listen to what they're saying and what their needs are. Now we're going to talk about some different tools when you are communicating to seniors. One of them is listening. Listening is a lost art. Do not rush the person to finish his or her sentence. Use careful and thoughtful speech. If they're in a wheelchair or if the person is sitting down, try and sit face to face with them. Enunciate clearly and ask questions and rephrase if you're not understanding what they're trying to communicate.
Hi, my name is Amanda Vasquez, and I work for the Great Plains Paralyzed Veterans of America. I'll be doing this section on physical disabilities. When you're speaking with someone who has a physical disability, offer to shake their hands just as you would anyone else. Those with limited hand use or an artificial limb usually can shake hands, and offering your left hand is acceptable. Be sure to place yourself at eye level when speaking to someone in a wheelchair or who is using crutches so that you're not speaking down to them, which can appear condescending depending on the situation. Do not lean on or place your hand on someone's wheelchair. And make sure, again, to speak to adults who use wheelchairs as adults.
One of the points that Amanda made on leaning or placing your hand on someone's wheelchair, someone who uses a wheelchair full time, they really feel like that's an extension of their body. So think about that as invading their personal space.
Exactly. Thank you, Mike. Do not be afraid to talk to the person about their disability or ask them questions. I believe this point was made earlier, and someone may not want to talk at length about their disability, but usually won't mind answering a question or two. The person is not broken. They do not want pity. If they happen to have a caregiver with them, be sure you don't say that he or she is lucky to have you as the caregiver. That's a bit condescending, so just avoid that altogether. Participation and quality of life are a right, and some of the biggest challenges that people with physical disabilities face are self-care, accessibility, transportation, and employment.
Hi, I'm Mark Smith. I work at the Monroe Meyer Institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. I'm also the parent and sibling of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, so a lot of what I'm going to talk about is very germane to my personal experience as well as my professional experience. There are a lot of terms that have been used in the past to describe people that have learning problems or developmental issues. And if you can think back, many, many years ago, terms like feeble-minded or the term mongoloid in reference to a person with Down syndrome were quite acceptable. And one thing that's changed over the last several years is the use of the term mentally retarded or retarded. What we found is that people with intellectual disabilities don't like that word. And there are a number of movements across the country where self-advocates, people with disabilities, are coming out and saying, we don't want that word used about us. They see it as a form of hate speech. And in fact, noted on the slide is the passage of Rose's Law, which was federal legislation that basically bans the further use of the term in federal documents. They're not going to go back and try and take it out of everything that's been written before. But in the future, that's going to be the case. And Rosa's Law was brought about by the siblings of a young woman with an intellectual disability. And so, it just shows the power of what individuals and families can have in terms of standing up for themselves and for their families. So what constitutes an intellectual or developmental disability? Historically, the criteria was set that if you were an individual that had an IQ of below 70, that you had an intellectual disability. However, that is a very limiting criterion, and more common now are functional limitations. That is, in one or more areas, the person has some kind of delay in their learning or development that's interfering with their daily life. And you can see on the list there learning, mobility, language, which we've talked quite a bit about, but self-care, self-direction, their capacity for independent living, which follows the others, as well as economic self-sufficiency. Folks that should, start to test in areas that are substantially lower than what would typically be expected would then be diagnosed with an intellectual disability. As was stated before, it's common courtesy to greet people as you would greet anyone, using the golden rule: treat others as you would want to be treated. So if you meet somebody with a disability and are introduced, offer to shake their hand. Treat people according to their age and not your perception. One of the things, this is especially important when we talk about people with intellectual disabilities. There's myths that abound about this idea of mental age, that a person with an intellectual disability really thinks like a child. And that really isn't the case. It's a much more complex mosaic than that. And so if you meet an adult, treat them as an adult. If you meet a child, talk to them like a child, but don't cross the two. It'll be seen as condescending, and it will interfere with your ability to communicate with that individual. Another thing that's been mentioned several times, and it's, again, very critical, if you see someone that you think needs assistance, it's perfectly okay to offer assistance, but wait until that offer is accepted before assisting. Don't step in and do something for someone else. I don't like that, and the people that I work with don't like that. They want to feel like they're being respected by people that they're dealing with. We've talked more about communication challenges, and I think this is an overlapping theme for most of the areas that we're talking about today. But it's true with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. About 90% have some kind of communication challenge, whether it's understanding others, being understood themselves, or some combination. And as stated before, it's important to listen attentively and wait for them to acknowledge whether they understood you or not. Asking questions to clarify is very appropriate. It's also very appropriate, as stated earlier, to ask, short, concrete questions that require short answers. But again, it's really important to watch your tone of voice and avoid talking down to the person. And also, never pretend to understand when you don't. If you don't understand, say so. And as also was said earlier, it's fine to ask a companion for help. That's a caregiver or someone who's with the individual, but always talk to the person, not the caregiver or companion. One thing that I think it's important to note, there's another myth that people with intellectual disabilities can be dangerous sometimes. And the fact of the matter is that people with intellectual disabilities are typically not a danger to others. In fact, they're less likely to be a danger to others than your typical man on the street. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities, according to national statistics, are much more likely to be victims of crimes as perpetrators of crimes.
I think that's a great point to keep in mind, is that especially as we're talking about how can we better serve people with disabilities, that it's truly they're not a danger to you. In fact, they in some ways probably need our help more than vice versa. So, but again, never assume.
One of the opportunities I've had in the last several years that I think is noteworthy is the work of the Omaha Police Department, who has undertaken extensive training on working with individuals with disabilities, including intellectual disabilities, so that they can do their job. And again, a lot of that is focused around communication and working with the individual in a respectful way. So they've done, I think, a marvelous job of taking this issue on. Because having worked in this field for a while, I can tell you there was a time where they were not as successful. So we're moving ahead and having, I think, more success.
Excellent.
Another critical piece in terms of people with intellectual disabilities, historically, they have been seen as less than, people that are defined by what they can't do. And remember, people are people first. And so it's important to note that everyone has strengths and everyone has weaknesses. And so when you're dealing with somebody with an intellectual or developmental disability, remember, they have strengths and they do some things well. Even people with significant disabilities still are going to have the things they do better than and they're really more alike their typical peer than dislike, and it's really important to keep that in mind. There's not a wide gap between people with disabilities and the typical population. They're much more alike than dislike other people.
Well, I think sorry to interrupt, Mark, but I think that's a great point. I mean, that's one that I think we've tried to point out in the presentation a number of times, that in all circumstances of a disability, the disability does not define the person, and that's where really that people are people first is the, I think that's the concept, and hopefully that's a message that as you hear this and view this presentation, that's really clear, that it's about the person and about being yourself and allowing them to be themselves as well. Absolutely.
And I think it's most critical to note that with support, individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities can fully participate in their communities. They can own homes, they can work in a regular job, just any experience, in terms of what's guaranteed to all citizens. It really is a right. It's not a matter of it being a privilege or something you have to earn. People with disabilities have the right, as guaranteed by the Supreme Court and by federal legislation, to live in the community, to work, to get the supports they need, because we know that if they get them, it's kind of a win-win. Number one, we see folks telling us that they're much happier in their lives, and the second point being that it really costs a lot less, than maybe some of the more traditional forms of housing and participation that were offered to people with intellectual disabilities. So a lot of this that we're talking about, is about their civil rights and how we need to ensure that those are guaranteed as we're working with any individuals.
Hello, I'm Mary Angus. I am a person who has mental illness, and I have my own company, Angus Disability Consulting. We're going to talk about mental illness now, and this has been a common theme. People who experience mental illness are no more different from you than other people are. We're more alike than we are different. Respect includes not using words like loony or nuts. They're not acceptable and they're not appropriate when describing another person. People with mental illness like to be treated with respect, just like the rest of us. Again, going back to the language you use about them or the assumptions that you make about them, for instance, that they might be violent or something like that. Treat people with mental illness and their comments or criticisms seriously. I can't tell you how many times people with mental illness and others have been dismissed when they are reporting abuse or a number of other things like that. It's usually when they're reporting something negative that people respond as if it's not true because, of course, quote, it's all in their heads, end quote. It's not always all in their heads. As a matter of fact, most of the time it's reality. If someone acts strangely, now when we talk about being afraid of somebody or maybe afraid they're going to be violent, if somebody's acting strangely, just stay relaxed. You're most likely not in any danger. People with mental illness are less likely to be violent than others without mental illness. And if you react in a calm way and patiently listen to what they have to say, most likely you're going to get a positive response and communication can continue. If you don't understand someone, ask them to repeat themselves or rephrase what you heard and ask if that's correct. Just like with anyone else, they may not be easy to understand. Perhaps they have a different perspective than you expect, and so you need to make sure you do understand what they're saying.
I think you hit on a great point, Mary, there. In really all circumstances, sometimes disabilities are more visible than others. And if you'd encounter somebody or communicating with somebody that you may not realize that has a disability until maybe you get into the conversation, I think continuing to be yourself, stay relaxed, and really just remembering some of the points that we've pointed out, that see the person and not the disability, and really help them to, if they need help, but try to help to get to the point that they're making, or stay engaged in the conversation.
Mike?
I think that's a good
We
point.
have a question from the audience, too.
I was just going to make a quick comment. Thank you. I was going to make a quick comment, and now I don't remember what it was.
We do have a question from the audience if you'd like to
Why don't we
take
go
it.
ahead with the question?
Our question is, how many times is it acceptable to ask a person to repeat themselves before exasperating the person?
My answer to that would be the same as with anyone else. You can generally tell when somebody's getting frustrated and exasperated by their, if they're agitated, if they get frustrated looking, if they get a variety of looks on their faces, that you can generally tell that with anybody. And then I would suggest that you say something like, I know this is frustrating, and I'm really sorry, but I'm the one, I don't understand what you mean, and I really do want to understand that. Mark?
I was just going to make the point, we're talking about a number of different categories of disability, and in some cases, individuals that don't really see themselves as disabled, but still present challenges in terms of communication. And I think it's important, for the general public to note that at any given point in time, somewhere between 18 and 20% of our population meets a criterion or criteria of having a disability. So it's not as if these are rare situations that will never come up. It's much more likely that in your neighborhood or your workplace, there are a number of individuals that meet some kind of criterion for having a disability. So we're talking about things that will confront you in your daily life, and will continue to do so and probably increase over time as we see more and more individuals taking part in their communities.
And I think that's a great point, Mark, and that really was I think the jumping off point for creating this presentation and pulling together the collective input of this group and how we can help the employees of the city in Douglas County and better serving and better communicating and interacting with persons that may have a disability.
I just wanted to add something to the question from the audience about how many times. In my experience, after about 1 or 2 repetitions, not only does the speaker start getting frustrated and exasperated, but so does the person who's listening, especially if that person who's listening is someone who's got 5 other phone calls or things going on and they need to get to the point quickly. So my suggestion would be, to do a couple repetitions and then maybe let the person know, this is what I think you're saying, this is what I'm understanding you to say, or these are the words I'm getting, can you help me with the words I'm not getting? Or, using one of those other strategies maybe so you can start expediting that communication so that not only is the person who's speaking not getting us frustrated, but also you as the listener are not getting us frustrated. Does that help answer your question as well as Mary's response? Okay.
I'm not sure, did we get that question on the mic so that people heard the question? Okay, thank you. Back to me. One of the things that really want you to remember is that people with severe or chronic mental illness have oftentimes been almost trained to tell you all about their illness. If they've been in therapy, if they've been hospitalized, if they've been in treatment for any extended length of time, they have had to sit and tell everybody that they sat down with what they're feeling, what it makes them want to do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They might have talked to a therapist and then talked to the nurse at the hospital, followed by a psychological tech, whatever, and oftentimes they'll say things about their mental illness that really might make you uncomfortable because they're offering too much personal information. It's perfectly all right to say to that person, thanks for all that information, but what is it, I really want to know what I can do to help you. And so that you try to switch the gears back to where you want to be, but understand that they basically have been trained to give that information, even when it may not seem very appropriate. Just really remembering that is important. I can't stress that one enough. But also, just because somebody is acting in a way that you don't understand, don't assume that they have a mental illness either. So anyway, that seems to me to be about the crux of the thing with mental illness and communication. Beth?
Hi, I'm Beth Ellsworth. I work for the Nebraska Commission for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. I'm also hard of hearing myself, and I am going to talk about deaf and hard of hearing. So here we go. Deaf and hard of hearing are not the same. A lot of times people think that being deaf is all-encompassing. There are different issues that come up for people that are deaf and people that are hard of hearing. And so it's real important to ask the person that you're meeting with or talking to find out first whether they consider themselves deaf or hard of hearing and what their needs are. People born deaf and people who lose their hearing later have different communication needs. So while one person might use sign language, another person might depend on lip reading. There are a lot of different combinations. Many do not consider lack of hearing a disability. This is true for both deaf and hard of hearing, and it just depends on the individual. Last, there are different forms of sign language. So for the deaf community, American Sign Language is a native language, so that would probably be someone that was born deaf and went to a school for the deaf, but not always. It's really important to make sure that you talk to the individual. Now we'll talk about some ways to communicate. Some people, deaf and hard of hearing, rely on lip reading. It is important to remember, though, that only 30 to 40% of the letters are visible on the mouth. So lip reading requires a lot of concentration and is not effective oftentimes. Some people, whether deaf or hard of hearing, communicate via sign language. That could be ASL, American Sign Language. It could be Signed Exact English, or a combination, which is called Pidgin, which kind of uses the ASL concept idea and English. Some use either form of communication according to their personal needs and situations. I am hard of hearing, and in some situations I will lip read, and mostly if it's no background noise or very little. Other times it might be that I choose to use an interpreter, and this is true of other deaf and hard of hearing. It is important to know that a lot of hard of hearing people do not know sign language and depend on lip reading and using assistive listening techniques.
Beth, what percentage of people that are deaf or hard of hearing, roughly what percentage are able to lip read? You had mentioned it's very difficult because there's only 30 to 40 letters that are, or characters that are visible on the lips. Can you give kind of an idea of what percentage of people can lip read?
You know, that's really going to vary depending on the individual, how much speech training they've had. Just so many variations. It is, I think that the most important thing to remember is that if someone is depending on lip reading, there is a lot of concentration required. And so much, I see a lot of times people that are not comfortable with their hearing loss will fake it or pretend that they understand what's being said. So if someone answers a question that requires, oh, what did you do over the weekend? And somebody answers yes or no, well, that's a pretty good clue that they didn't really hear and understand what you were saying. There's really no yes or no.
I just wanted to add from a speech perspective and from a perspective of a person who has a hearing loss. From a speech perspective, many of the sounds we make for speech, we make inside of the mouth. We don't use lips for it, we use tongue, and you can't see those when you're looking at someone's face. So unless you've had really intensive speech reading training, the things that Beth are saying are very, very true. I know I use like a variation of speech reading in that I need to see the person's face when they're talking to me, and when I'm at a presentation where they've turned the lights down, and especially if several people are talking at the same time. I'm one of those people who tries to fake it and pretend like I know what you're saying, but I'll be one of those people who says the wrong thing as the answer because I didn't get everything, because I can't use speech reading when the lights are down and when several people are talking at the same time. So didn't mean to interrupt you, Beth, but
no problem.
And I wanted to add something in terms of my personal experience. One of the things that I've found, many times you'll meet someone who is deaf or hard of hearing, and they'll be wearing a hearing aid. And so your natural assumption might be that you can speak to them normally, but you really need to check and ask, because that may aid the individual, but that does not necessarily mean that they can hear the entire range of sounds and carry on a conversation just because they have a hearing aid. It really depends on the individual and the level of hearing deficit.
Well, I think if you think of it in terms of you attempting to have a conversation with someone in a very busy, loud room, there's lots of noise that can distract you or make that conversation harder to understand. And maybe that's not an exact analogy, but I think it probably points, gets the point home to someone who has is fully able and hearing, to kind of put you in a similar situation.
Well, that's a real good point that you bring up, Mark, because, talking about myths, two myths that stand out that I hear more about than any of the others is, one, if someone has a hearing aid, one or two, or has a cochlear implant, or there's different kinds of hearing aid, the Baha hearing aid. If they have that, then problem solved, everything's great, and the person is now hearing and able to communicate. And that can be true whether there's background noise or not. Just because someone has a hearing aid or a cochlear implant does not mean that they have normal hearing, that they're fixed. So keep that in mind. The other myth is that people can lip read. No problem, just automatic. And it is extremely difficult to lip read. And it's not something that happens overnight. Many people take lip reading classes or just practice on their own. Now we're going to talk about some different techniques of talking and communicating with deaf and hard of hearing. It's really, really important to speak a bit more slowly and face the person. That does not mean that you go, okay, now I will talk to you. That will make it much more difficult because natural mouth movements is the important thing. It's also extremely condescending to have that happen. Also, keep your hands away from your mouth. Even though lip reading is difficult and not really effective many times, it's important that the deaf or hard of hearing person be able to see the face, read the lips. And I know that everyone that I've met that is deaf or hard of hearing really takes it all in. For myself, I use lip reading. I watch the expression. I need to have background noise turned off or very limited. So it's using everything that's possible. When in a group, it's important that only one person speak at a time. The reason for this is that hearing aids and cochlear implants, if they're wearing one of those, it picks up whatever's closest. And so it makes all that background noise not just loud like it is normally, it amplifies it. So that makes it even more difficult. The last thing is eliminate or reduce background noise. And we've talked about that. It's so important to make sure that the environment is conducive to having a conversation. If it's not possible to eliminate or cut down the noise, go to another room where there is some quiet. I know for me, I go into a restaurant or some place and there's always background noise. They've got the radio playing, they've got some announcements going on overhead, lots of different things. So just keep that in mind. Now, this is just a real brief talk about deaf and hard of hearing. And if you would like to know more, give me a call. I can be reached at 402-682-7129. Thank you.
I think a lot of the information that you mentioned, Beth, and that we've mentioned throughout the presentation, it's just common courtesy. Oftentimes when in a group, we should just have one person speaking at a time, but I think we're all eager to share our side of the story and our input. So one of the other things we wanted to include in the presentation are some general disability access symbols. I think most people are very familiar with the symbol for someone with a physical disability, the person in a wheelchair. Most of us have seen the symbol at the bottom left, the two C's for closed captioning. But there are a number of other symbols that help us to communicate with persons that may have a disability and how we can better serve them. And I don't know if anyone wants to jump in and comment. Are there other symbols that you wanted to maybe specifically mention? I think most of them we've seen and are fairly self-explanatory. Really, go ahead, Mark.
I was just going to add one thing that was kind of unique on the part of several parents that I've worked with over the years. In the case where they had a child that had a disability that may not be very good around being in the street and recognizing danger and traffic and such, instead of putting up child with a disability or a disability sign, they put up caution deaf child, as in this child may act like he's not hearing you coming, but in fact, and which I don't know if might be intruding on other people's circumstances, but what I found is that kind of common where it helps traffic, be aware that there might be a child that's not, able to recognize when a car is coming. So,
right.
Just something to point out. If you see that, please slow down.
Certainly, there's so much overlap in how we react and how we interact with persons that have a disability, and I think it's well summed up in what we mentioned in one of the first slides, and how we'd like to end our presentation is that people are people first. And the bottom line is remembering the golden rule is that we should always see the person and not focus on necessarily what their disability is. And I think that's how we all want to be treated. Also, for city employees, for ADA issues, there will be more information coming. But if you have questions or would like more information, you can contact the Human Rights and Relations Office at 402-444-5055. Again, that number is 444-5055. And certainly the department is eager to assist you and make sure that you feel comfortable in getting your questions answered and how you might better serve the citizens of Omaha that have a disability. With that, we'd like to thank you for your time, and thanks for taking the information and putting it into use.